Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the bishop d3 gambit in the advanced variation of the French defense. So the French defense begins with the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the advanced variation is when white now plays the move pawn to e5, and black will generally strike back at the center with the move c5, trying to get rid of the pawn on d4 so that black can attack the pawn on e5. And white will say, no, no, no. If you take my pawn on d4, I will just replace it with another pawn. So then black plays knight to c6, putting pressure on these two squares and also, developing a piece. Good stuff. White plays knight to f3, also developing a piece and countering the pressure put on these two squares. And now black plays the move queen to b6, putting some pressure on the d4 pawn and also on the b2 pawn. And this is an important tabia in the advanced variation. And previously we looked at the move bishop to e2. So in this game, we will look at the move bishop to d3. And this is kind of an interesting move. White puts their bishop on the best diagonal that is available to it. Maybe something could happen on the h7 square someday. Don't know. But the problem with this move, the downside, is that it blocks the queen's defense of the pawn on d4. This move, it's very often played as a gambit. White will very often be giving up the pawn on d4. So in this game, with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Šarūnas Šulskis from Lithuania. He is a many-time Lithuanian champion who has won the Lithuanian chess championship multiple times. And he has also very often represented the country of Lithuania in the Chess Olympiad as well as in the European Team Chess Championship. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Giri, and he is a many-time champion of the Netherlands, and he's also a very famous super grandmaster and hilarious Twitter user. But for us, the most important thing to know about Grandmaster Giri is that he has authored a number of opening courses on Chessable, including an excellent course on the French defense, which I used as a reference when looking for good games to cover as well as good lines to consider. In fact, this particular game is from that course, and it just does a wonderful job of illustrating how to refute the bishop d3 gambit. And this game was played in the 43rd Chess Olympiad in 2018. And more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. So back to the game. In this position, white now has the ability to castle, so I often like to use that as a way to remember that black should now take the pawn on d4 with their pawn. So black takes this pawn as, black really wants to attack the pawn on d4 and not allow white to maybe play d takes c5, which would maybe weaken the pawn on e5, but at least white wouldn't have to worry about defending the pawn on d4. White takes back with a pawn in order to keep the pawn on e5 defended. And here it is very important that black not win the pawn on d4 right away, as this is a very well-known opening trap. If black were to play knight takes d4, then black loses at least a knight. Because after knight takes d4, if black plays queen takes d4, then whoops. Oh no, black's queen. Thankfully, that is not what happened in the game. Remember that trap. Instead, in this position, black played the move bishop to d7, with the idea being, of course, that if black now tries to win this pawn, bishop to b5 would no longer be a check. So in this position, white played the move knight to c3. Castling kingside is a bit more common, but generally the idea of castling kingside is to still play knight c3 on the next move. move. In this game, white did it the other way around. There isn't really any serious difference between the two. And the engine really does not like the move knight to c3. The engine really wants white to play the move bishop to e2, but this would make no sense. If white plays bishop to e2, then what was the point of putting the bishop on d3? White would have essentially wasted a move, wasted the tempo, and you generally only want to do that if you're provoking your opponent into making a bad move. But in this case, the move that black would have received for free is move bishop to d7, which is just, a decent move. It's the only square that the bishop can be developed to, so it is by no means a bad move. So bishop to e2 would make no sense. And other moves to consider are bishop to e3, but this move is actually just terrible. Black would play queen takes b2, and not only would black have won on a different pawn, but the rook on a1 is under attack. So white has to deal with that. And now black would have the move knight to b4, threatening both the bishop and potentially the rook. And this position is just horrible. Like, white could try the move knight to b3, but then black would have the move queen to c3 with check. And now white has to go bomb cloud style, because otherwise the bishop on d3 will be lost. So here comes king e2, and after knight takes, queen b4, black just has a very nasty initiative. Like, white should not play like this. This is just horrible. So that is why bishop to e3 would be a terrible move in this position. Another interesting idea is bishop to c2, but it's not really that great. Like, black will be able to trade their knight for the bishop on c2. If white tries to save the bishop with a move like bishop to a4, for example, then black can just play queen to a6, and then white can get rid of black's ability to castle. But the problem is that white can't castle either, and black's pieces are much more active than white's. So if anybody is going to be attacking the opponent's king, it's going to be black who's going to be doing that. And similarly in this position, bishop to b3, similar idea, just queen a6 again. And so that's why bishop to c2 is not so great. And let's see, back in this position, knight bd2 is kind of the main alternative to knight c3 stuff, but black can still just take the pawn and then just retreat the queen afterwards and just be fine. But another interesting idea for black is again the move knight b4, and if white tries playing bishop to b1 to keep the bishop safe, to avoid it being traded and to keep it on this nice diagonal, black would activate their own bishop and put it on a nice diagonal, again stopping whites from castling and being very annoying. And so that is why I personally consider knight c3 to be the most critical, most interesting of the choices. So back in this position, white plays knight to c3, and black decides, okay, I'll just take the pawn. Let's see what you have. And now in this position, black is now threatening to take this pawn with check. So white castles, and it's actually very important here that black not take the pawn, as white will just get too much of an initiative. In fact, there's even a funny little forced repetition. So for example, if queen takes e5, then white would play rook e1, and black has to be very mindful that the pawn on e6 will be pinched to the king. So if queen to b8, then knight takes d5 would give white plenty of compensation. White would only be down one pawn, and black's development would just be, what is this? This is horrible. So instead, black would want to put the queen on d6 to just keep the queen developed and defend the pawn on d5. But then white would have the move knight to b5, harassing the queen again. And if white tries to keep the queen developed with a move like queen to b6, then, sorry, if black tries to keep their queen developed, I should say, white has to move bishop to e3, and there's actually a forced repetition here, because if black tries to move queen d8, then white has bishop to f4 with the idea of playing knight to c7. And if black tries bishop to c5, then just takes, rook c1. Again, the same idea. Knight c7 check would win material. So if instead of that, black puts the queen on the only real square that defends c7, if black plays queen to a5, it's important to note that if white now tries bishop to f4, then black can just take the knight. Then white instead would play bishop to d2, and we would have a forced repetition, which is not what black wants, because black is the one who is up a pawn. Black is the one who, like when you receive a gift like that, you want to win the game. You don't want to draw. So anyway, that is why in this position, black did not take the pawn. Black instead took a look at what white wants to do, thought about how white is going to get counterplay, and realized that the best move to play is the move pawn to a6, as now black is threatening to take the pawn on e5, because now the idea of knight b5 just doesn't work anymore. So here, white plays the move queen to e2, developing the queen and also defending the pawn. Very sensible stuff. And in this position, black played another very important move. Let's see if you can figure it out. This is not a tactical move. Just try to figure out what black should do next. That's a very good exercise. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. The move that black played, and the best move is rook to c8. And the reason why this is the best move is because black wants to develop their pieces. In particular, black wants to develop their kingside pieces. But if you look at black's knight, you see that the knight doesn't it only really has one good square to go to, and that's on e7. But if it goes to e7, then it will block black's bishop on f8. So black ideally wants to get their bishop out first. But the bishop obviously should not go to e7, because that would stop the knight from being developed. And the problem with bishop to b4 is that the bishop doesn't really do anything over there. Like, it looks like black might be able to win a pawn here, but black would also be creating a number of imbalances and chaos in the position. For example, best move according to the engine would be to just play rook to d1, threatening some annoying tactics with the bishop. Black can take on c3 if they want, but it's not a good idea. After takes, white would play rook to b1, getting another piece into the game and threatening this pawn. And if black tries to save this pawn, white is just getting way too much compensation in this position, as white's pieces are very active, white's king is castled, and black's pieces are, well, most of them are not participating in the game, and the ones that are very passive. So black should not play like this. Like, the bishop b4 idea with winning a pawn is not a good idea. Like, that's black's good bishop. Black should not be giving it up. In fact, black should be trying to use this bishop to stop white from, stopping white from attacking black or making progress with white's plans. And so instead of trading this bishop for a knight that can no longer really participate, as this knight has been, kind of stopped from doing anything, black wants to put this bishop on c5. But there is a problem with putting the bishop on c5 right now, which is that white would have the move bishop to e3. Normally, white would not be able to play bishop to e3 because the pawn on e5 would hang, but in this case, the bishop would be left undefended if black were to take. So after a move like queen to b4, pawn to a3, queen to b6, bishop takes, queen takes, white would play queen g4, hitting this weak pawn over here, and at least getting some compensation for the gambited pawn. Like, white's pieces would again be quite active, and black would have to do something about the weaknesses in their position. Black would have to, give something up, either, weaken the pawn structure, give up the right to castle, or make the queen passive. Like, those are all, not fun choices to be making. So, as a result, bishop to c5 right away doesn't work either. So then, the best move is to prepare the move bishop to c5 by getting another piece into the game with rook to c8, activating this rook, and if black now plays bishop to c5 and white plays bishop to e3, then black can just very safely just take the pawn on e5. So that is why rook to c8 was the best move. And so in this position, white played the move king to h1, getting their king out of this pin because white probably wants to play the move pawn to f4 at some point, as the pawn on e5 is a little bit vulnerable. Black might want to attack it at some point, but also white might be able to push the pawn to f5 and maybe get some kind of attack going. Maybe try to blast open the center, do stuff like that. So black now develops their bishop to c5, and white tries to put their bishop on the best square available to it. And black says, no, get that bishop out of there. It's important to note that if black waits a move before playing h6, for example, if black plays a move like knight e7, just developing their knight, then white would be able to play f4, and that would give the bishop access to the h4 square. So that's why black instead went h6 right away, because if the bishop goes to h4, then the queen will just take it. So the bishop goes back to d2. I would not really consider this to be a waste of a tempo, because the move h6 isn't really that useful for black to have. It might be a potential weakness that maybe white can make use of. So black just develops their final piece. And in this position, white played the move rook a c1, which is a decent move. But in my opinion, if I had the white pieces, I would go f4. I think f4 is a better try. Like, try to do something, try to get some kind of attack going. The move f4 doesn't actually work because black has the move knight to f5, and kicking this knight out is actually very difficult to do because, like, if white tries a move like this, then black's knight gets in with the move knight e3, and this is a very nasty knight. Like, maybe white wants to try rook f3, but that would actually hang the pawn on g4, so that's not too fun. But still, in my opinion, f4 is a better try than rook a c1, but we're like 15 moves into the game. I would say if you're able to remember black's moves up till this point, you're doing very well. In fact, you shouldn't even be trying to memorize the rest of the moves of this game. You should just be trying to understand black's philosophy, like how black is going about playing this game. The main thing to understand about black's play is that black is currently winning, and black does not really need to prove anything. Black doesn't need to create chaos on the board. Black just wants to convert. Black just wants to improve their pieces, play very calmly, and just win. And just, go to a favorable endgame and maybe promote this pawn. Like, what's important is that not only is black up a pawn, but it's a center pawn, and it's a protected passed pawn as well. So it's a very, very valuable pawn. And like, it's not like black is up an h pawn where it might be a little bit iffy as to whether that's really that big of an advantage. It's like, no, this is a wonderful center pawn that black is going to be able to make use of in the long run. So anyway, in the game, white played the move rook a c1, which is an okay move. It develops the rook somewhat, gets it onto an open file, and now black just castles. Very, very reasonable move. In fact, probably the best move in my opinion. And just, all of black's pieces are out. Black just wants to consolidate. So in this position, white plays the move pawn to a3, threatening a nasty tactic. Let's see if you can see it. So for example, let's say black makes a very silly move with the move king to h8. If you want, you can pause the video and see if you can spot the tactic that white is threatening or white would play in this position. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. The idea of the move pawn to a3 is to prepare pawn to b4. And after the bishop retreats, say to a7 or b6, it doesn't actually matter which one, white would then play bishop to e3 and win the bishop on a7. So that is the idea behind pawn to a3. And so there are a number of ways that black can prevent this. For example, black could play the move knight to f5, which would free up the e7 square as a potential retreat for the bishop. But the move knight to f5 could potentially introduce some more imbalances, as there could be some chaos, like maybe white could try g4 at some point, or maybe white just trades bishop takes f5, and then after pawn takes f5, this pawn is a little bit weakened and stuff, and you've got doubled f pawns here. So black doesn't really want that kind of chaos in the position. Black just wants to win very cleanly without too much fuss. So that is why black instead went for the move queen to h4, which is a move that looks a little bit scary, looks a little bit risky, but black had calculated that the queen is not going to get trapped. The queen is just in time to escape. So, my apologies. In this position, knight g6 is better than knight f5, but again, there's still a similar problem with bishop takes g6, f takes g6. Like similar problem in that would introduce more imbalances, potentially weaken black's pawn structure, and any imbalances, any sort of chaos, dynamic play, any kind of that stuff is only going to help white. So that's why black went with their choice of playing the move queen to h4, as this move is not too chaotic. Although if you're going to play this move, you have to be very sure that the queen is not going to get trapped, as the queen is kind of far away from her friends and all that. So white plays the move pawn to f4, trying to trap the queen with the move bishop to e1, as illustrated over here. And there are a few ways that black can, save the queen, like again, making moves with the knight. But again, that would introduce some potential imbalances that black might not want. So black instead decided to save the queen with the move pawn to f5, which could also introduce imbalances, but in this case, the imbalances are a lot more clear that they benefit black. As if now white tried the move bishop to d1, black would play queen to g4, escaping this way, and if white went for this queen trade, then this pawn on g4 isn't actually that weak. It's actually a bit tricky to actually win it, to actually attack it, but not only that, but it's improving black's position. Like black's rook is improved, and now the knight can very safely come to f5 without worry of ruining pawn structure or anything like that. And also there are some threats, such as bishop to e3, maybe winning this pawn, on attacking this rook at the same time. So that's why this imbalance just looks very good for black. Like this is a lot less uncertain, a lot less chaotic. So that's why black would be much happier to see this than the other stuff with knight g6 earlier or knight f5 earlier. So instead of white going for that, white played the move knight d1, trying to rotate their knight, maybe bring their knight to the king side, maybe do something, although it's very unclear, what exactly white can do at this point. It says black has just done a great job of keeping things together, of consolidating. So in this position, black now plays the move bishop to e8, potentially getting the bishop to the h5 square, where maybe it'll be black attacking white's queen instead. And now white went for bishop to e1, and black was like, okay, fine, instead I'll put my queen on h5, as this, again, is a very safe move. Move like queen g4 would still be decent. That would still be an okay move. Like maybe part of the idea of knight to d1 was just to defend the e3 square from black's bishop over here. But queen h5, like black knows that this move is very safe to make. Like, black is up material, black is winning, black just wants to keep things simple. And black would actually be very happy to trade queens, especially if there is no chaos that's introduced. And white, of course, does not want to trade queens, as white wants to potentially go for some kind of attack, or maybe a perpetual check in the endgame. So black now plays the move rook c6, which is a very cool little move. It's very hard for white to actually get at this rook, and the rook is also keeping an eye on the e6 pawn. And maybe black might want to use the c8 square, like just a very cool little move. Of like, oh, it frees up the knight. That's another thing to mention, as the rook was only defended by the knight when it was on c8, but now, black doesn't have to worry too much about the knight being tied down to defending the rook. Like, pawns are much better at defending than pieces. Anyway, in this position, white played the move knight f2. The engine considers this inaccurate, but it's honestly very difficult to find good moves for white. Like, white's position is very, very difficult to play, so I don't blame white for making the occasional inaccuracy, and it's actually very unclear why the engine's preferred moves are the best moves, so not going to waste time on that. Black plays bishop to a7, trying to simplify once more. Note that if black played bishop a7 earlier, then the trade happening with the knight coming to c8 isn't as good as the trade happening with maybe the knight coming to c6, or the bishop coming to c6, or even the pawn coming to c6. So that's why black would prepare for this move first with rook c6. And white decides to attack the queen with bishop e2. Black moves their queen away. White does not want to trade rooks. Black just calmly keeps improving their pieces. White plays knight d3. Black plays rook c8. White plays bishop d1. Black brings their rook back to c7. White plays a4, potentially stopping black's bishop from coming to b5. Stuff like that. And black's pieces are all very well placed. It's hard to improve them further, so now it's time for black to go on the offensive. Black plays pawn to d4. And in this position, again, it's hard to find a good move for white. The engine really wants white to play the move knight to b4 here, just to stop maybe black from putting their bishop on c6. I do kind of agree with that. But instead, white plays the move bishop to b3. Black plays bishop to c6, improving, their worst piece. White plays bishop to f2, trying to put a bit of pressure on this pawn. The knight is blockading it. And here, black plays bishop to d5. Basically trying to trade away white's only good piece in the position, the only active piece that's getting in black's way. So white only really had two choices here, to either accept the trade or to make the bishop passive. White chooses to accept the trade. But one issue with that, of course, is that it does, in the process, improve black's knight. White tries to fight for the c-file. Black hits the pawn on a4, threatening to trade and then maybe take this pawn on at some point, something like that. And white's like, no. I'm going to not allow that to happen. Of course, black would probably have to prepare, with the move king h7 before taking the pawn, because, the queen might be able to come to c8, stuff like that. But anyway, white makes some luft, gets ready to hide their king, very sensible. Black improves the positioning of their knight and threatens to put their rook on c2, where it would just be devastating, would be a very strong rook. White plays the move knight to e1, which does defend c2 square, but the problem, of course, is that that's a very passive square for white's knight. Black plays queen c6, putting a little bit of pressure on the g2 pawn. on, and maybe getting ready to do something like knight c2 at some point. Maybe something like that. That's like knight c2. If the rook comes to c1 to pin the knight, then there's queen takes a4. So instead of that, as white plays bishop takes e3, which the engine really doesn't like, but I don't blame white for doing this. Like, white was just under a lot of pressure, just a lot of bad stuff happening. That knight was a monster. Black takes back with the pawn, and now this pawn is kind of a monster because since the pawn is always being defended by the bishop, the only piece that can really take the pawn at any point is the knight. So white blockades the pawn, stops it from going forth any further. Black plays queen e4, centralizing the queen, supporting the pawn, and still keeping an eye on this guy over here. Now white moves their knight as it has now been somewhat freed up from defending the c2 square. It can instead block this queen's vision of that square. Black attacks the knight, rook d7. White tries to keep things together with the move rook a3. Black fixes the pawn on a4, just tries to keep it there as it's a weakness in white's position. Black's constantly trying to win that thing. White plays king h2, just hiding their king. Black also hides their king, very sensible. White plays the move h4, as white isn't too afraid of pushing the pawns in front of their king, like especially since white probably foresees what black has planned. And like basically, since like in major piece endgames, king safety is a very important thing. Like especially when the queens are still on the board. And when there are queens and rooks, you have to be worried about getting checkmated in particular. But when it's just queens, like when the rooks vanish, then white isn't really going to be afraid of getting checkmated by black's queen, as the queen is going to have difficulty delivering checkmate by itself. Like normally you would be afraid of perpetual check, but since white is losing, white has no fear of perpetual check. White would be very happy to take a draw now. So that's why white has started pushing their pawns. So black plays the move rook d4. White probably foresaw this. White plays the move pawn to h5, which is a cool move. I like this idea, as white might potentially, like in the long run, even though this is, you know, kind of a desperation tactic, might try to do something like somehow get the queen to g6 and then e8 and then just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You know, that's an important perpetual check pattern to remember, even though black, of course, is never going to allow that in a million years. Here's like black is all too familiar with those kinds of patterns. So black takes the pawn on a4, or white trades rooks, as white, you know, is going to be pushing the pawns in front of their king. White doesn't want to worry about potentially getting checkmated by queen and rook. So white throws their other pawn in front of the king. Black takes, and it's important that white not take back right away, because if white were to play the move queen takes g4, then queen c2 check would win white's knight, and that's not good. So instead, white played the move king g3 first, and then black played queen e4, having the queen keep an eye on this knight, so white can't take the pawn with their queen. White instead takes with the king. Black plays the move bishop to d4. We're trying to remember the idea of this move. I think it was just to kind of tie up the knight, just so that black might be able to take on e5, or to just somewhat improve the positioning of the bishop. Doesn't matter too much. Black is just consolidating, and black just has to make sure they don't make any moves that are bad or anything like that. So black just starts pushing their queenside pawns. Like this central pawn does a good job of just distracting white's pieces. If black can get something going, you know, down the queen side as well, then, you know, black will win. White plays knight e1. Black now plays bishop to c5. 5, getting ready to maybe reroute the bishop, as the bishop might want to support the queenside pawns. White plays knight to f3. He may be trying to do something with this knight, although it's unclear what. The knight is kind of stopped from getting in. Like, the knight wouldn't really be doing much on g6 unless the queen somehow got to the back rank and could deliver a checkmate on h8. But that's very wishful thinking. So black plays bishop to e7, just rerouting the bishop to a safer square where it still supports the queenside pawns. Black plays knight to h2, and white plays white plays knight to h2, black plays pawn to b5. And white, of course, cannot take this pawn because then that would just drop the knight. Right? In fact, it might even be worse than losing the knight. Although white, at the very least, is going to lose the knight because there is no way to stop promotion besides giving up the knight. Right. So anyway, that's why white did not take the pawn on b5. White instead played knight to g4. Trying to win the pawn on e3, but black just keeps marching up the board. And in this position, I suppose that white could take on e3, but black would, we will probably see that similar idea later in the game. I remember it appearing later. White instead goes for some tricks with knight to f2. Getting ready to, it looks like maybe black could take the knight, and then if white takes the queen, promote to a queen. But the problem, of course, is that when white takes the queen, it will be with check. So white was probably playing for some tricks here. Black plays queen to f5. White goes back to g4. Pawn to a3. Takes. And now white does, in fact, take the pawn on e3. But we see what would have happened earlier, which is just that white's pieces are all tied up. Like, white's queen has to stay on this knight, and black's going to go a2, a1 equals queen. So white only really has one choice in order to prolong the game, and that was to play the move queen to c2, pinning the queen to the king, essentially forcing this queen trade. But the problem, of course, is that this endgame is completely losing as the knight is tied down to this pawn. And so white tries to do something to stop this. Black is getting ready to go in with the move bishop to b2 and then just promoting the pawn, winning the knight. So white tries to create some chaos with the move pawn to f5. Black just takes. White comes forward trying to win back the pawn. Black pushes their pawn. White plays the move pawn to e6, maybe hoping that the bishop comes here and that the pawn can run down. But black doesn't fall for that. Black just plays bishop to d6 check, and that was the final move of the game. White chose to resign in this position, as the way that black is going to win is basically white's king is going to be forced back, and then black can just take this pawn, and then, the two pawns over here, white's king is not going to be able to stop them. It can sit in front of them, but it can't take either one of them, because then the other one would run up the board. And similarly, this knight over here is all tied up. In fact, if we were to remove, this pawn and bishop and put the king back here, and just have these two pawns, I think even that endgame would be winning for black, just because white's pieces would be completely tied up. Anyway, that is how black would win. Black would just take this pawn, and then, similar to the previous game, the king would not be able to take either of these pawns. They would just keep the king occupied, and then black would just bring their king in and win this pawn, and then maybe bring their king over here, or maybe bring their king to support these two pawns. Either one works. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense why white resigned in this position. Anyway, I hope that you liked this game. As usual, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And that's all for now. Thank you, and goodbye.